March 17, 1945, Camp Concordia, Kansas. Sergeant Howard Mitchell stood at the edge of the prisoner compound, watching as a new group of German POWs filed through the gates. Their uniforms, though worn and muddied from the Atlantic crossing, still carried the crisp lines and structured tailoring of Wehrmacht issue. The prisoners walked with heads high despite their circumstances, and Mitchell could see several of them exchanging glances and barely suppressed smirks as they took in the American guards. One tall Oberfeldwebel, his insignia still visible on his collar, gestured toward Mitchell's loose-fitting olive drab jacket and said something in German that made his companions laugh. Mitchell didn't need a translator to understand the mockery. He had seen it before, in every batch of prisoners that arrived from Europe. The Germans looked at American uniforms and saw slovenliness, lack of discipline, inferior craftsmanship. They saw confirmation of everything their propaganda had told them about the decadent, unserious Americans who couldn't possibly match the martial excellence of the Third Reich. What none of these prisoners understood, what they would only begin to comprehend in the coming weeks, was that the very uniform they mocked represented a revolution in military logistics, textile engineering, and industrial planning that would fundamentally reshape how armies equipped their soldiers for generations to come. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The story of American military uniforms in World War II began not with tactical planning or martial tradition, but with a crisis that threatened to undermine the entire mobilization effort before it properly started. In September 1940, as the United States initiated its first peacetime draft and began expanding the Army from fewer than 200,000 men to what planners hoped would eventually become millions, the Quartermaster Corps faced a sobering reality. The existing uniform production system designed for a small professional army could not possibly scale to meet the demands of total war. Traditional military tailoring required skilled craftsmen who measured each soldier individually and constructed garments using techniques unchanged since the previous century. A single dress uniform might require 8 to 12 hours of labor. Field uniforms took only slightly less time. The mathematics were impossible. Even if every tailor in America worked exclusively on military contracts, they could not produce uniforms fast enough to clothe the expanding forces. Colonel Edmund Graves, Deputy Quartermaster for Textiles and Equipment, summarized the challenge in a memo that would circulate through the War Department for months afterward. Current production methods cannot support mobilization at required scale. We face a choice between maintaining traditional standards and equipping the force we need to field. There is no middle path. His words captured what many officers refused to acknowledge. The army they were building would be the largest in American history, drawing men from every state and territory, from farms and factories, from cities and frontier towns. These men needed uniforms immediately, not after months of custom tailoring. The challenge extended beyond simple production capacity. Traditional military uniforms prioritized appearance over function, emphasizing the sharp lines and fitted silhouettes that conveyed military bearing and discipline. Jackets were tailored to fit snugly at the waist and shoulders. Trousers were cut narrow through the leg. The resulting garments looked impressive on parade grounds, but proved impractical for the realities of modern mechanized warfare. Soldiers needed to move freely, to bend and stretch and crouch. They needed pockets that could actually hold equipment. They needed fabric that could withstand rough use without constant repair. Most importantly, they needed uniforms that could be manufactured by the millions using industrial methods rather than artisan craftsmanship. The solution began taking shape in laboratories and design studios far from military bases. The Quartermaster Corps reached out to the textile industry, to chemical companies, to academic researchers who studied fabric properties and garment construction. What emerged from these collaborations was nothing less than a reimagining of how military clothing could be designed, manufactured, and distributed. At the Philadelphia Quartermaster Depot, a team of designers led by Captain Robert Thornton began developing what they called the simplified service uniform. The concept was radical in its departure from military tradition. Instead of custom tailoring, they would use standardized sizes based on anthropometric surveys of thousands of American men. Instead of wool broadcloth that required careful handling, they would use new synthetic blends that combined durability with easier care. Instead of complex construction with multiple fittings, they would design garments that could be assembled on production lines by workers with minimal specialized training. The anthropometric research alone represented an unprecedented effort. Military medical personnel measured over 100,000 soldiers, recording not just chest and waist measurements but arm length, shoulder width, neck size, inseam, and dozens of other data points. Statisticians analyzed this information to identify clusters of body types that could be served by standardized sizes. The final system included 5 size categories, from extra small to extra large, with regular, short, and long variants for different height ranges. It was a compromise that would never fit anyone perfectly but could fit almost everyone adequately. More importantly, it could be implemented at industrial scale. The fabric innovations proved equally important. Traditional military wool, while durable and warm, had significant drawbacks. It absorbed moisture, making uniforms heavy in wet conditions. It required careful laundering to prevent shrinkage. It was expensive to produce in the quantities needed. Chemical companies including DuPont and Monsanto developed alternatives. They created wool-cotton blends that maintained warmth while reducing weight and improving moisture management. They engineered synthetic fibers that could be woven with natural materials to enhance durability. They developed treatments that made fabrics more resistant to water, mildew, and wear. The result was a new generation of military textiles that outperformed traditional materials in almost every practical measure, even if they lacked the luxurious feel and appearance of pure wool broadcloth. The jacket that would become the standard M1941 field jacket embodied these innovations. Cut loosely through the body to allow freedom of movement, it featured 4 large patch pockets that could hold maps, ammunition, ration tins, and other essential items. The fabric was a cotton-wool blend that shed water more effectively than pure wool while drying faster when wet. The construction used flat-felled seams that could be sewn quickly on industrial machines while remaining strong enough for hard use. Most controversially, the fit was deliberately loose, with none of the tailored shaping that characterized traditional military dress. To European eyes, particularly German eyes, this looseness looked sloppy and unmilitary. What they failed to recognize was that every design choice served a practical purpose. Captain Thornton defended the design in a presentation to skeptical senior officers who worried that loose uniforms would undermine military discipline and bearing. "Gentlemen, we are not outfitting parade ground soldiers. We are equipping men who will fight in jungles, deserts, and frozen forests. They will wade through rivers, crawl through mud, and sleep in their uniforms for weeks at a time. They need garments that facilitate movement, that dry quickly when wet, that can accommodate layers underneath for warmth, and that won't split at the seams when a man has to run or climb or dive for cover. If that means sacrificing the crisp appearance of a dress uniform, then that is a trade we must make." His argument prevailed, though not without resistance from officers who believed that military appearance and military effectiveness were inseparable. Production of the new uniforms began in earnest during 1941 and accelerated dramatically after Pearl Harbor. The Quartermaster Corps contracted with hundreds of manufacturers across the country, from established clothing companies to factories that had never made garments before. The standardized patterns and simplified construction made this possible.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
A factory that normally produced work clothes could retool to make military uniforms with minimal difficulty. A plant that made civilian shirts could start producing military shirts within weeks. The system was designed for exactly this kind of rapid scaling. By mid-1942, American factories were producing over 4 million uniforms per month. By 1943, that figure exceeded 6 million. The total wartime production would eventually reach over 65 million complete uniform sets, a manufacturing achievement unprecedented in military history. But quantity alone was not enough. The Quartermaster Corps also had to solve the challenge of getting the right sizes to the right places at the right times. This required developing supply chain management systems that could track millions of individual garments moving through global distribution networks. Warehouses in the United States received uniforms from factories, sorted them by size and type, and shipped them to regional depots. From there, they moved to ports for overseas shipment or directly to training bases for new recruits. In overseas theaters, theater quartermasters managed additional distribution networks that delivered uniforms to combat units in the field. The entire system relied on meticulous record-keeping and coordination. Requisition forms traveled up the chain from company supply sergeants to battalion quartermasters to division supply officers to theater headquarters. Shipments moved back down the chain, ideally arriving before units depleted their stocks. The system was imperfect, prone to delays and occasional shortages, but it functioned at a scale that would have been impossible with traditional methods. When the 101st Airborne Division needed complete uniform replacements after heavy losses in Normandy, the supply system delivered thousands of uniforms in correct sizes within 2 weeks. When the 1st Marine Division returned from Guadalcanal with uniforms rotted by tropical conditions, new sets arrived before the division completed its training for the next operation. This logistical capability, invisible to enemy observers, represented as significant an advantage as any weapon system. The Germans, meanwhile, maintained their traditional approach to military uniforms. German uniforms were undeniably well made, constructed from quality materials by skilled workers who took pride in their craftsmanship. The field gray wool used for Wehrmacht tunics was dense and durable. The cut emphasized the soldier's physique, with tailored waists and structured shoulders that created an imposing silhouette. Officers wore custom-tailored uniforms that reflected their status. Even enlisted men received garments that fit relatively well and looked sharp. This emphasis on appearance reflected deep cultural values about military service and national pride. A German soldier was meant to look like a warrior, and the uniform reinforced that identity. But this traditional approach created vulnerabilities that German planners failed to anticipate. The emphasis on quality materials meant that German uniform production remained dependent on wool supplies that became increasingly scarce as the war progressed. The skilled tailoring required trained workers who could not be easily replaced when casualties mounted. The relatively fitted cut that looked impressive on parade grounds proved less practical in combat conditions, particularly in the extreme environments of Russia and North Africa. Perhaps most critically, the entire production and distribution system lacked the flexibility to adapt quickly to changing needs or to scale up rapidly when losses exceeded projections. German Oberleutnant Klaus Fischer, captured in Tunisia in May 1943, would later describe his first impressions of American uniforms with barely concealed contempt. "We saw these Americans in their baggy jackets and loose trousers, and we thought they looked like workers, not soldiers. Our uniforms showed discipline and pride. Theirs showed nothing but carelessness. We could not understand how such unmilitary-looking men could possibly fight effectively. It never occurred to us that perhaps military effectiveness and military appearance were not the same thing." Fischer's comments, recorded by American intelligence officers during routine prisoner interviews, reflected a widespread attitude among German prisoners. They judged American military capability by superficial indicators and found it wanting. This underestimation extended beyond uniforms to broader assumptions about American military competence. German prisoners often expressed surprise that American forces could fight at all, having been told by propaganda that Americans were soft, undisciplined, and incapable of matching German martial excellence. The loose American uniforms seemed to confirm these prejudices. Surely a serious military power would dress its soldiers properly. Surely discipline began with proper military bearing and appearance. The Germans saw what they expected to see and drew conclusions that would prove catastrophically wrong. The first hints that German assumptions might be flawed came not from combat performance but from prisoner camps themselves. As German prisoners arrived at camps across the United States, they encountered the full scope of American industrial capacity and organizational efficiency. Camp Concordia in Kansas, where Sergeant Mitchell served, was one of over 500 POW facilities that the United States established during the war. These camps housed approximately 425,000 German prisoners by 1945, more than any other Allied nation. The prisoners worked on farms, in factories, and on infrastructure projects, always under guard but treated according to Geneva Convention standards. They received adequate food, medical care, and shelter. They were paid modest wages for their labor. They had access to educational programs and recreational activities. For many prisoners, especially those captured later in the war when conditions in Germany had deteriorated significantly, American POW camps offered better living conditions than they had experienced in months or even years. But what struck prisoners most forcefully was the abundance of everything. The camps had electricity that worked reliably. The food, while simple, was plentiful and varied. The medical facilities had adequate supplies and modern equipment. The guards had new uniforms, boots that fit properly, and equipment that functioned. Trucks arrived regularly with supplies. Warehouses were stocked with spare parts, replacement clothing, and other necessities. This logistical abundance stood in stark contrast to what most German soldiers had experienced, particularly those who had served on the Eastern Front or in North Africa, where supply shortages were chronic. Sergeant Howard Mitchell had grown up in rural Pennsylvania, the son of a factory worker who lost his job during the Depression. He remembered the lean years, the uncertainty, the sense that nothing could be relied upon. When he enlisted in 1940, he expected military life to be equally precarious. Instead, he discovered an organization that, for all its flaws and frustrations, generally provided what soldiers needed when they needed it. His uniforms arrived on time. His boots were replaced when they wore out. The mess hall served hot meals 3 times daily. When his unit deployed for training exercises, the trucks had fuel, and the supplies arrived as scheduled. This might seem unremarkable, but Mitchell understood that reliability at this scale required sophisticated planning and execution. The army fed, clothed, and equipped millions of men spread across multiple continents. The fact that it mostly worked, most of the time, was itself extraordinary. Mitchell's assignment to Camp Concordia came after he sustained a minor injury during training that left him with a permanent limp. Unable to deploy overseas, he instead became part of the military police contingent that guarded German prisoners. He approached the assignment with some trepidation, expecting to encounter hardened fanatics who remained committed to Nazi ideology. What he found was more complex. Some prisoners were indeed committed Nazis who refused to acknowledge Germany's deteriorating situation. But many others, especially those captured in 1944 and 1945, were exhausted men who seemed relieved that their war had ended. They were farmers conscripted from Bavaria, factory workers from the Ruhr, students who had never fired a shot before being thrown into combat in Normandy or the Ardennes. They wore the same uniform and carried the same ideological baggage, but their individual circumstances varied widely. One prisoner in particular caught Mitchell's attention during those first weeks. Feldwebel Ernst Richter had been captured during the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive in the West. He was 32 years old, older than most of the other prisoners, and carried himself with a quiet dignity that earned respect even from the guards. Richter spoke some English, learned from a British POW with whom he had shared a cell in North Africa before being transferred back to Europe. He was polite, followed regulations without complaint, and seemed genuinely curious about America and Americans. Unlike some prisoners who maintained hostile silence or spouted propaganda, Richter asked questions. He wanted to understand how American society functioned, how the military was organized, how ordinary Americans lived. Mitchell found himself having occasional conversations with Richter during camp routines. Nothing deep or philosophical, just brief exchanges about practical matters or observations about camp life. Through these conversations, Mitchell began to understand how fundamentally different German and American perspectives were, not just about the war, but about basic assumptions regarding society, organization, and national purpose. Richter had grown up in a society that emphasized hierarchy, order, and collective identity over individual initiative. The military he served reflected these values. There was a proper way to do everything, from how to fold a uniform to how to address superior officers. Deviation from established procedures was discouraged. Excellence meant perfect execution of defined standards. American military culture, by contrast, emphasized adaptability and individual initiative within a broader framework of mission objectives. There were regulations and procedures, certainly, but also an expectation that soldiers would figure out solutions to unexpected problems using whatever resources were available. This difference manifested in countless small ways that Richter struggled to understand. Why did American sergeants have so much authority relative to officers? Why were uniform regulations enforced inconsistently, strictly on some occasions but casually on others? Why did Americans seem unconcerned about the sloppy appearance of their field uniforms? To Richter's orderly German mindset, these inconsistencies suggested lack of discipline. What he failed to recognize was that American military culture prioritized different values. Appearance mattered less than function. Rigid conformity mattered less than effective problem-solving. The turning point in Richter's understanding came unexpectedly during a work detail in late April 1945. Prisoners at Camp Concordia were regularly assigned to work on local farms, helping with spring planting and other agricultural tasks. The labor addressed wartime manpower shortages while giving prisoners something productive to do. On this particular day, Richter was part of a group working on a farm about 15 miles from camp. The guards, including Mitchell, maintained watch while prisoners helped repair fencing damage during winter storms. The work was simple but physically demanding, requiring frequent bending, stretching, and climbing. The German prisoners wore their original Wehrmacht uniforms, now faded and patched but still recognizable. The American guards wore standard field uniforms. As the afternoon progressed and the temperature climbed into the 80s, Richter noticed something that challenged his assumptions. The German prisoners in their fitted wool tunics were overheating. Several had unbuttoned their jackets, but the heavy fabric still trapped heat. Richter himself felt sweat soaking through his undershirt, making the wool cling uncomfortably. Meanwhile, the American guards in their loose cotton blend jackets seemed far more comfortable. The looser fit allowed air circulation. The lighter fabric breathed better than wool. When one guard needed to climb a fence to secure wire, his loose uniform moved with him rather than restricting his movement. Richter realized, perhaps for the first time, that the Americans had designed their uniforms for exactly this kind of work. They had sacrificed appearance for practicality, and in practical terms their choice made sense. That evening, back at the camp, Richter mentioned his observation to another prisoner, Unteroffizier Hans Weber, who had been captured in Normandy. Weber dismissed it immediately. So their uniforms are comfortable. That does not make them proper military uniforms. A soldier should look like a soldier, not a laborer. Richter tried to explain that perhaps function mattered more than appearance, but Weber would not listen. Like many prisoners, he clung to the belief that German military superiority was inherent and unchallengeable. To acknowledge that Americans might have made better practical choices about something as fundamental as uniforms was to question the entire foundation of his worldview. But Richter could not stop thinking about what he had observed. Over the following days, he began paying closer attention to other aspects of American military equipment and organization. He noticed that American boots, while less elegant than German jackboots, were more comfortable for long marches and easier to maintain. He observed that American soldiers carried more ammunition and supplies because their uniforms had better pockets and their equipment was designed to distribute weight efficiently. He saw that when American trucks broke down, spare parts arrived quickly, and mechanics fixed them using standardized components. The entire American military system, he slowly realized, was designed around different priorities than the German system. Germans emphasized tradition, appearance, and adherence to established procedures. Americans emphasized functionality, flexibility, and logistical efficiency. This revelation was both enlightening and deeply unsettling for Richter. He had spent his entire adult life in a military culture that taught him that German methods were superior, that German discipline and martial spirit would overcome any material disadvantages. Now he was beginning to understand that perhaps material advantages, particularly advantages in industrial production and supply chain management, mattered more than spirit. Perhaps the Americans, with their loose uniforms and casual manner, had built a more effective military machine precisely because they had focused on practical effectiveness rather than traditional military virtues. It was a disturbing thought, particularly as news filtered into the camp about Germany's deteriorating situation. By late April 1945, everyone knew the war was nearly over. Hitler was dead or dying. Berlin was falling. The Third Reich was collapsing. But why had Germany lost? Richter had believed the propaganda about German superiority. Now he wondered if that propaganda had blinded Germany to American strengths. The final piece of Richter's education came from an unexpected source. In early May, just days after Germany's surrender, the camp received a shipment of surplus American uniforms intended for prisoners who needed replacement clothing. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners be clothed adequately, and by this point in the war, many German uniforms were worn to tatters. Camp administrators decided to issue American field jackets and trousers to prisoners whose original uniforms were no longer serviceable. This practical decision triggered intense reactions among the prisoners. Some refused outright, seeing wearing American uniforms as a betrayal of German identity. Others accepted pragmatically, recognizing that their worn-out German uniforms offered little protection or dignity. Richter, whose uniform was still intact, did not need replacement clothing, but he watched the controversy with interest. Weber was among those who refused most vehemently. "I will not wear the enemy's uniform. I am a German soldier. I would rather wear rags than dress like an American." His words reflected genuine emotion, a sense that uniform was identity. But other prisoners, particularly those who had been captured early in the war and had spent years in American camps, took a different view. One Obergefreiter named Peter Kaufmann, captured in North Africa in 1943, accepted an American field jacket gratefully. His original tunic had holes in both elbows and a tear across the back that no amount of patching could fully repair. When he put on the American jacket, adjusting the loose fit and examining the sturdy fabric, he turned to Weber with a wry smile. "This is more comfortable than anything I have worn in 2 years. Perhaps the Americans understood something we did not. Perhaps looking like a soldier matters less than being effective as one." The argument that followed revealed the divisions among the prisoners. Some, like Weber, maintained that German methods and German pride were inherently superior regardless of circumstances. Others, like Kaufmann, had begun questioning assumptions they had held for years. Richter found himself somewhere in between, still loyal to Germany but increasingly aware that loyalty did not require blindness. He thought about the farms he had seen in Kansas, prosperous and mechanized in ways that German farms rarely were. He thought about the abundance of food, the reliable electricity, the well-maintained roads. He thought about American trucks that always seemed to have fuel and spare parts, while German vehicles he had seen in France were often immobilized for lack of basic supplies. Most of all, he thought about those loose-fitting American uniforms that he and his comrades had mocked, and wondered how many other things they had misunderstood. Sergeant Mitchell observed these debates among the prisoners with interest. He did not speak German well enough to follow detailed arguments, but he could read body language and sense tensions. He noticed that Richter seemed different from many other prisoners, more thoughtful and less ideological. One evening in mid-May, as Mitchell supervised the prisoners' return to their barracks after a work detail, Richter approached him with a question. "Sergeant, may I ask you something about American uniforms?" Mitchell nodded, curious where this was going. Richter continued carefully, choosing his English words with precision. "When we first arrived, we thought your uniforms looked unmilitary. We thought they showed lack of discipline. But I have been watching and thinking. I believe now that we were wrong. Your uniforms are designed for function, not appearance. Is this correct?" Mitchell considered the question seriously. "I suppose that's right. We don't care much about looking sharp in the field. We care about whether our gear works and whether we can do our jobs. Some of the brass don't like how casual we look compared to European armies, but most soldiers appreciate having uniforms that are comfortable and practical." Richter nodded slowly. "In Germany, we believed that military bearing and military effectiveness were the same thing. A soldier who looked sharp would fight well. A soldier who looked sloppy would fight badly. But perhaps this is not true. Perhaps it is possible to look unmilitary but fight very effectively." Mitchell smiled slightly. "I think that's exactly right. We proved it in France, didn't we?" Richter acknowledged the point with a rueful expression. "Yes, you proved it very well." This conversation marked a subtle shift in the dynamic between Mitchell and Richter. They began having more frequent discussions, always brief and superficial given the guard-prisoner relationship, but gradually revealing deeper currents of thought. Richter wanted to understand how America had built such an effective military machine so quickly. Mitchell, though not educated in military logistics or industrial planning, could share observations from his own experience about how the American system functioned. Neither man would have called their interactions friendship, but they developed mutual respect grounded in honest recognition of realities that propaganda had obscured. As spring turned to summer in 1945 and the full scope of Germany's defeat became undeniable, many prisoners at Camp Concordia began reassessing their beliefs about the war, about Germany, and about themselves. Some clung to Nazi ideology, insisting that betrayal or circumstance rather than genuine American superiority had caused Germany's loss. Others, confronted with evidence of concentration camps and Nazi atrocities, experienced profound crises of conscience about what they had served. Still others simply focused on survival, hoping to return eventually to Germany and rebuild their lives in whatever form the post-war world would take. But a significant number, including Richter, began engaging with the uncomfortable reality that perhaps Germany had lost not because of betrayal or bad luck, but because German assumptions about military effectiveness had been fundamentally flawed. The story of American military uniforms was, in the end, a story about competing philosophies of military organization. Germany had built a military that emphasized tradition, appearance, and rigid hierarchy. This approach produced soldiers who looked impressive and fought bravely, but it created supply systems that could not adapt quickly to changing circumstances and production methods that could not scale adequately for total war. America had built a military that emphasized pragmatism, industrial efficiency, and logistical flexibility. This approach produced soldiers who sometimes looked unmilitary by traditional standards, but it created systems that could clothe, feed, and equip millions of men across multiple continents while maintaining supply lines that functioned reliably even under enormous strain. Neither approach was inherently superior in all circumstances. German methods worked well for the professional army Germany had maintained before the war. American methods were specifically designed for the challenge of rapid mobilization and global deployment, but when these two systems collided in total war, American advantages in industrial capacity and organizational flexibility proved decisive. The loose American uniform that German prisoners mocked was not evidence of slovenliness or lack of discipline. It was evidence of different priorities and different solutions to the challenges of modern warfare. The Germans had optimized for appearance and tradition. The Americans had optimized for function and scale. In the contest between these approaches, function and scale won. By late summer 1945, with the war against Japan concluded following atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, attention turned to the massive task of demobilizing American forces and repatriating prisoners of war. German prisoners at camps across the United States knew they would eventually return to Germany, though the exact timing remained uncertain. The Germany they would return to bore little resemblance to the nation they had left. It was divided, occupied, devastated by years of bombing and ground combat. Cities lay in ruins. Infrastructure was shattered. Millions of people were displaced, searching for lost family members or simply trying to survive amid the wreckage. For prisoners like Richter, who had begun questioning the assumptions that led Germany into catastrophic war, the prospect of return was both hopeful and deeply anxious. What role could they play in rebuilding a nation that had embraced ideology so thoroughly destructive? The prisoners had no way of knowing how their experiences in American camps would shape post-war Germany. Many former prisoners would become advocates for democracy and reconciliation, having seen firsthand that Americans were not the decadent weaklings that Nazi propaganda had portrayed. They had experienced fair treatment and humane conditions even as prisoners. They had observed American prosperity and organizational capability. These experiences would inform their efforts to rebuild Germany along democratic lines during the occupation years. The contrast between Nazi propaganda and experienced reality created space for fundamental reassessment of values and beliefs. Not every prisoner underwent this transformation, but enough did to make a meaningful difference in Germany's post-war development. Sergeant Mitchell received orders in September 1945 that transformed Camp Concordia's program. The War Department initiated comprehensive re-education for German prisoners, exposing them to democratic principles. Mitchell coordinated visits, bringing prisoners face-to-face with American industrial capacity. The first visit took Richter and 30 others to a textile factory in Wichita, Kansas. The factory floor stretched endlessly with machinery performing specific operations in uniform assembly. Cutting machines sliced through dozens of fabric layers simultaneously. Sewing machines stitched seams at impossible speeds. Assembly lines moved partially completed garments from station to station. The factory manager explained this single facility produced over 15,000 complete uniform sets weekly, working 3 shifts. Richter stood transfixed by the scale and efficiency. He had worked briefly in a German uniform factory before the war, a smaller operation where skilled tailors constructed each garment individually. That factory employed perhaps 200 workers and produced maybe 500 uniforms weekly. This American facility, with only slightly more workers, produced 30 times that volume. What struck Richter most powerfully was realizing this factory was not unique. The manager mentioned casually that similar facilities operated across the United States. Hundreds of factories, employing hundreds of thousands of workers, producing millions of uniforms monthly. The sheer scale of American industrial mobilization was staggering. On the bus ride back, Richter sat beside Weber. Weber stared out the window in silence before finally speaking. "We never had a chance, did we? Not really. We thought our discipline and fighting spirit would overcome American material advantages, but how do you overcome that?" Richter had no answer. Mitchell observed the subdued mood among prisoners during the return journey. These men had been raised believing German superiority was natural and inherent. Now they confronted evidence that comprehensively contradicted everything they had been taught. The psychological impact was profound. The re-education program continued through autumn with additional visits and educational sessions. Prisoners attended lectures about American government, watched films about democratic institutions, and participated in discussions. American authorities wanted these prisoners to return to Germany as advocates for democracy rather than embittered revanchists. Richter proved receptive. He attended every available lecture, asked thoughtful questions, and engaged seriously with ideas contradicting his previous beliefs. He was particularly interested in American federalism, constitutional separation of powers, and civil society institutions independent of government control. In November 1945, Mitchell received notification his service would conclude in January. He would be discharged and could return to civilian life. The news brought mixed emotions. He felt a strange connection to this place and to some prisoners, particularly Richter. One cold December evening, Richter approached Mitchell with a request. "Sergeant, I know you will be leaving soon. I wanted to thank you for treating us fairly and with respect." Mitchell felt uncomfortable with gratitude from a prisoner. "I just did my job." Richter smiled slightly. "Yes, but regulations are interpreted differently by different men." Richter continued, "May I ask what you will do when you leave the army?" Mitchell shrugged. "Go back to Pennsylvania. Find a job, probably in a factory like my father did. Try to build a normal life. And you?" Richter's expression grew serious. "I do not know what Germany I will return to." Mitchell's discharge came through in early January 1946. His final day at Camp Concordia was quiet and unremarkable. As he walked toward the camp gate for the last time, he saw Richter working on a detail near the fence. Their eyes met briefly. Richter raised his hand in a slight wave. Mitchell returned to Pennsylvania and found work at a steel mill outside Pittsburgh. He married, started a family, and lived a quiet, productive life. He rarely spoke about his time at Camp Concordia, but Mitchell felt his service had been meaningful. Richter returned to Germany in late 19. His family had survived but lived in difficult circumstances. Richter found work as a translator, his English skills making him valuable. The uniform story continued to unfold in ways that would reshape military thinking worldwide. The American system of standardized sizing, simplified construction, and mass production became the template that armies across the globe adopted in subsequent decades. The loose-fitting American field jacket that German prisoners had mocked became iconic. Photographs of American soldiers from World War II wearing those practical, comfortable uniforms came to symbolize a particular kind of military effectiveness. Not the parade ground perfection of European tradition, but the pragmatic, functional approach. The textile innovations driven by military requirements also revolutionized civilian clothing. Synthetic fibers developed for military use found applications in everyday garments. Standardized sizing systems pioneered by the Quartermaster Corps influenced how civilian clothing manufacturers designed their products. By the early 1950s, as the Cold War intensified, the uniform systems developed during World War II remained largely unchanged. Designers made incremental improvements to materials and construction, but the fundamental approach endured. When American forces deployed to Korea in 1950, they wore uniforms that were direct descendants of World War II designs. German rearmament in the mid-1950s with the creation of the Bundeswehr took a different path. The new German military adopted NATO standards for equipment and organization. German uniform designers created garments that balanced traditional German military aesthetics with practical functionality influenced by American methods. Richter, by then working as a civil servant in Hamburg's municipal government, observed these developments with interest. He had remained engaged with questions about military organization and national defense. He followed debates about German rearmament and contributed occasional articles to newspapers about the importance of subordinating military power to civilian authority. In 1963, Richter received an unexpected letter from the United States. Howard Mitchell had tracked down Richter's address through military records and German civil registries. Mitchell's letter was brief, explaining that he had been thinking about their conversations at Camp Concordia and wondered how Richter's life had unfolded. Richter responded immediately, surprised and moved by the contact. Over the following months, the two men exchanged several letters, sharing information about their families, their work, and their reflections on the war years. Their correspondence continued sporadically for several years. The broader story of American military logistics and industrial mobilization during World War II has been studied extensively by historians and military analysts. The achievements were remarkable by any measure. The United States transformed from a nation with a small peacetime military into the arsenal of democracy, but the uniform story offers particular insight into how this achievement was accomplished. It reveals the importance of design thinking, of questioning traditional assumptions and optimizing for practical requirements rather than inherited conventions. The loose American field jacket that looked unmilitary by European standards was actually highly sophisticated equipment. The German prisoners who mocked American uniforms in 1945 were making the same mistake their military planners had made throughout the war. They judged by superficial appearances rather than understanding underlying capabilities. They saw loose-fitting jackets and concluded that Americans lacked discipline. This cultural difference extended far beyond uniforms to encompass broader questions about how societies organize themselves and pursue collective goals. German culture emphasized hierarchy, order, and conformity to established patterns. American culture, with its emphasis on individualism, pragmatism, and willingness to discard tradition when necessary, proved more adaptable. The story reached its final chapter in the mid-1970s, when both Mitchell and Richter had retired from their respective careers. Mitchell's children were grown, pursuing their own lives across America. Richter's family had prospered in post-war Germany's economic miracle. Mitchell passed away in 1978, having lived a full life shaped by Depression-era hardships, military service, and the post-war boom. He left behind children and grandchildren who knew little of his experiences at Camp Concordia. But his values, shaped by those experiences, had influenced how he raised his children. Richter lived until 1989, long enough to see the Berlin Wall fall and Germany begin reunification. He died believing that Germany had successfully transformed itself, that democracy had taken root in soil where authoritarianism had once flourished. The uniforms themselves, millions produced during the war years, mostly ended up destroyed or recycled. Some were sold as surplus after the war. A few were preserved in museums or private collections, becoming artifacts that historians studied to understand the material culture of World War II. But the real legacy of the American uniform story was not in the physical garments, but in the ideas they embodied. The principle that function should guide design rather than tradition. The recognition that mass production could achieve quality at scale if processes were designed intelligently. The mockery that German prisoners directed at American uniforms in 1945 reflected a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of modern warfare. They saw loose jackets and concluded weakness. They saw industrial mass production and concluded lack of craftsmanship. Every conclusion was wrong because every observation prioritized surface appearances over underlying capabilities. This same pattern of underestimation occurred across multiple dimensions of the war. German planners underestimated American industrial capacity, assuming that a nation of farmers and shopkeepers could not possibly match German manufacturing capabilities. They underestimated American innovation, American determination, and American logistics. The men who stood at Camp Concordia in March 1945, laughing at American uniforms, represented the final stages of this underestimation. They had fought bravely, had served their nation as they understood duty, had endured hardship and danger, but they had been poorly served by leaders who fed them propaganda rather than truth. The loose American uniforms they mocked were products of a system that had consistently outperformed German capabilities across every dimension of industrial warfare. Recognition of that truth came slowly and painfully for men raised to believe in German superiority, but reality eventually overwhelmed propaganda. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.